new friends who are coming in now. I think this is great. We have an audience I don't even recognize individuals. This is fantastic. I think we'll want to hear later what avenue was it that you heard about this through, so we can make sure you amplify that more. So today we have a couple of engineers from Blue Origin to talk to us about user experience. So Kyle Pontier and Ivan Tolmachev. I got that right. And I didn't actually read the whole thing here. But
that's all right.
Yeah, and really we want to hear about what took you to Blue. I think this is sort of a new perspective that we haven't really heard about from Blue, which is that user design experience. A lot of people have been hearing about the rocket propulsion kind of things. So I'm just going to let you take it from there. So nominally 20-ish minutes, I think that's what Amy told you. And then we really want this to be a conversation with people in the audience, so please do converse. And it looks like they brought swag to help them with that. So.
Some swag for people that ask questions. Hi everyone, my name is Ivan. First of all, thank you to Christy, Sadia, Amy, and everyone at the University of Washington. We met late last year at the Spark inaugural symposium, and it was a really nice conversation that started during the conference, where we're really talking about the fact that when you think of aerospace industry, you start thinking about engineers, people that make engines, rockets, etc. We don't really talk about people that we're hoping are going to live in space and work in space, which is every one of us, regardless of where we are and what we study. So this is an exciting time, and I applaud the initiative for academia and industry to kind of meet and talk like that. And this is going to be a little bit unorthodox because we are the user experience group at Blue. We don't design or build engines. We design for people that are either using those or for people that are going to be using our products, so for humans, essentially. So I've been designing digital products for 10 years myself, and I've been at big and small companies working on products, starting designing from scratch, as well as just marginal feature mature products. And every workplace demanded I be both a designer and something else, a software engineer, DNA scientist, and that makes sense, right? To design an experience with someone, you need to really understand who that someone is. I'm not going to lie, when I started out as a young buck, like 8 years ago or so, I had a lot of doubt in my career path because every single time designing, the craft of design felt a little bit like something that is part of the job, but not actually the job. It always was sort of like a side quest, if you will. Sometimes the craft of user experience design is misunderstood, and I still believe that it is in today's world, even though the iPhone has been out for more than a decade. We kind of all know what a good app versus a bad app looks like. So when I met Kyle, he was at Blue for 2 years and was wrapping up a user experience team at Blue. His background is in industrial design. He worked with clients like Panasonic, Boeing, various airlines during his time at Teague. And within our group at Blue, we have an unofficial title for Kyle, an experienced design evangelist. And I couldn't be happier to have him start a conversation on what design is and what it means actually to design from the uncharted. So without further ado, Kyle Pontier.
Thank you, Ivan. So a couple asterisks to today's conversation. One is this is not a talk from Blue Origin. This is a talk from 2 designers, experienced designers that work at Blue Origin. So this is really encompassing our worldview and how we kind of impart those methods, tools, and techniques at a company like Blue Origin. The second thing you'll notice is I changed the title. I did that about a week and a half ago as I started to put together this talk. But I realized with my body and spirit is still a part of it, but as I started to put it together, the conversation was broadening. If I was given the talk at the School of Human-Centered Design, my body spirit would have been appropriate. We could have gone down a rabbit hole around methods, tools, and techniques regarding getting at people's mind, body, spirit. But considering the audience, considering the conversation space, I wanted to broaden the conversation space a little bit more, just to give you a more holistic look at what types of things that Ivan and I and others talk about from our worldview when we talk about experience design in humans. So, we are at an interesting inflection point right now in human history. Certainly, we've always had the dreams and aspirations and goals of wanting to live and work in space. And you've seen this come to fruition in many different ways, through sci-fi novels, through movies, all sorts of ways this has been articulated. But right now, we're on this cusp of change. And going forward, we're really seeing the possibilities of, in developing the technologies to start to act on that, at least the early ages of acting on that. And so what I really want to do is talk about how experience design is important to meeting those goals. When we have things like annealed colonies happening, right, it's just not users that are going to be in space, but also people, humans across the board. So we're going to spend the next 20 minutes, I'll try to keep it to 20 minutes, talking about why it's important for experience design to be involved in the conversation when it comes to putting humans in space. In one word, it's empathy, right? Human experience design, user-centered design, it's all geared around the social sciences of psychology, anthropology, ethnography. And all of these sciences, humanities, they're really geared towards empathy. How do we understand people? And when I say empathy, what I mean is the ability to understand and share the feelings of others, which innately we all do as humans anyway. It's part of our DNA to do that. But when we are working and living in the fast pace of life, the ever-increasing pace of life, right, we can often like put that in the back seat because we're trying to get stuff done. We're trying to produce something. And often that can come at the cost of people. Not always in a bad way, but not always in the forefront. So when I talk about empathy, I'm really talking about how do we take into account the feelings of other people and how do we design around the feelings of people or the possibility of feelings that could be involved in any product or experience or service that we're actually creating. And the reason why empathy is important is because of this. So when we were just creating anything, when we were designing anything, we need to keep people at the forefront. Experienced designers, in some way, in many of the jobs that I've had over the last 20 years, part of that job is actually play the role of therapist, right? To just sit, and we're trained to do that really, really well. I'm not saying we're psychologists, though. I don't have a degree or a PhD. You can't pay me to come listen to you. Well, maybe you can, but not in the medical. But often, you know, it's really through the training of the act of observing and listening is where a lot of the strength of human experience design really starts to show its merit. I can't tell you how many times over the years that I've been in meetings or in situations where people are just talking past each other. They're not really listening to each other. They're trying to get their point across at all costs, and you hear people interrupting other people and all this kind of stuff and shouting over other people. You know how you know when someone's not listening? If you're being interrupted, because they're so engaged on actually trying to get their words out instead of taking into account what you're trying to say and then respond accordingly. So with that in mind, you know, and it makes sense from a human experience design point of view that we are trained listeners because that is the catalyst in which our work and our merit derives from. And so when I'm talking about designing for people and human experience design, well, I'm talking about human experience. There's so many diagrams about this out there, right? You just go Google human experience or user experience, you'll have so many Venn diagrams pop up. And they're all right. Some are better than others, but there's a truth in them all, and the fact that people, like I was saying, are often, I won't say left out of the equation, but holistically they're often not accounted for across the board of all aspects of being human. And you know, there's some good reason for that, depending on what the goal is at hand or what the task is at hand. But inevitably, right, as we start to progress our futures of people living and working in space, we need to account for all types of humans, users, and people being involved. In this diagram, you'll notice that, right, I come from a school of design and architecture. Design is just one component to actually creating a human experience, right? You certainly got to have the social sciences, the psychology, the anthropology, the ethnography to understand really what people in their tribes that they belong to, what motivates them. And what motivates them creates emotions, and emotions create behaviors. And ultimately, we want to design for the behaviors that we want. But if we take the time to take a step back and look at what the emotions are and the motivations that are driving these things, we can actually create richer experiences that are much more fulfilling in the long run. So I want to unpack the phrase design for human affairs a little bit. When I talk about design, I'm talking about anything. Everyone is a designer in this world, explicitly or implicitly. It's objects, environments, systems, processes, policies, anything you name it, right? One way to think about it is anything that's man-made is designed. I even say nature is, right? Because through sciences, right, we're also starting to manipulate nature and design nature for better or for worse in many different degrees. One of my favorite things to talk about to explain the world of design is hospitals, the whole healthcare system, because it accounts for all of it, objects, environments, systems, processes, and policies. It's really how these things get invoked that really are the telltale sign of how well these things are done and how, in terms of healthcare, how fast someone can actually recover. It's often not about just the tables that someone may be laying on, or screens that the doctors are using, but it's the services that involve patient care, the before, during, and after aspects of all healthcare. This is a picture from a surgeon's training room at the Mayo Clinic in Florida. And the Mayo Clinic is one of the best examples of putting design and people at the forefront of the endeavors that they take into account, because they understood decades ago that healthcare just does not have to do with treating people in the moment, but it also has to do with the entire engagement with the healthcare system. Whether it be before, how do I get involved? How do I talk to a doctor, right? They're looking at new ways and new technologies to make that happen in a much more expedited way, in a much more meaningful and caring way. To the bills that you receive afterwards, right? Sometimes you can't even understand the pieces of paper that are coming in the mail, and people are being charged tens of thousands of dollars without actually understanding what's going in it. So you see things like the bills being redesigned, the layouts and the typography of everything, so actually consumers can really understand what's going on when they get their bills and figure out, why am I being charged so much? And then you take that further into the experience realm, like if you look at GE Health and other companies, right? They're looking at, for children, for example, these are very scary experiences for kids who don't know the world that well yet. And so GE, when they're looking at their CT scanners or MRI machines, they're not only just looking at the machine better for the operators how to use them, but they're looking at how do we design the machine so they're a little bit more approachable and friendly to 3-year-olds and 7-year-olds, let alone the entire environment in which these things are housed. So kids can come in and feel comfortable, more comfortable than they would previously, which in the end actually helps the doctor. If you're sitting there getting, I don't know if anybody's ever had an MRI, you have to sit still in this very kind of scary machine, even as a doll, that's clicking and noise going on. And so what they do is they paint a story around it, a narrative around what they're getting involved in. That way it helps the kids feel relaxed and feel at bay, and they can actually sit still for a half an hour while the magnetics are going on. I'll even talk about food nutrition labels, right? This is a policy design effort, but how you invoke those policies makes a world of difference to the consumer. It's been a long policy that companies or food makers have to put the food, provide the food nutrition information on the side of any food product, most food products. But then several years ago, they were doing some consumer testing on this and realizing most people don't get this. Most people, it's just too dense of information, or the information hierarchy of information is not well understood because it's just packed full of data. And so then several years ago, after that study, they started to redesign the food labels so they're a little bit more consumer friendly and understood by the consumer, so they actually knew what they were putting into the body. They were making a more explicit choice on what they were able to do, on their choices of what they were bringing in. Net, when I talk about design, yes, there's schools of designs, there's design artifacts, but really, at the middle level, design is a problem-solving tool, right? That's why I say everyone's a designer, right? Because we're solving problems at work, in life, in relationships, in one-on-one settings, every day, most moments of our life. So this is a riff on the British Design Council put out this double diamond design diagram years ago, which I thought was great. And then this guy, Dan Nestler, took it a little bit further and started putting all these methods, tools, and techniques within it that helped really explain what you should be doing along the way. And it's not really those details that I want to talk about really, but it's really the two diamonds that are the most important things to me. The first thing you do is figure out the right thing to do, right? And you do this by going out into the world doing ethnography, anthropology. You do these social science studies and research to understand, what's going on with people, what are the real problems to be solved, and then how do you actually carry that forward with a good strategy to then go do things right. If you just go look around the world, all these failing products, all these millions of dollars invested in products that really didn't see the light of day or failed upon release, it's often they're jumping ahead and just trying to do things right. And you can make the prettiest, most beautiful thing in the world, but if it's not actually going to solve the problem that it's intended for, it's useless, right? And the world is just littered with these types of things. The people who really get it, the companies that are really successful, actually take a step back and go figure out what is the right thing to go do first, and they invest up front and early to understand where we should be going in the long run as a strategy, and then going and doing the things right. So when I talk about humans, this is the mind, body, spirit aspect, right? Cognition, physicalness, and the emotional aspects of people. And it's complex because there's not only the personal side, but there's a social side. It gets more complex than that, right? When I was at Microsoft, I did this long tail study of what does identity mean to people, right? And that's a very nebulous kind of question to answer. People are multifaceted. Who you are in this room is different than who you are at home, than who you are out at the bar with friends, than who you are at home with your parents, right? We curate our identities to the situation at hand. So just because I say personal doesn't mean it's a fixed being. We as people are very dynamic depending on our setting, personal or social settings, and it's constantly evolving as we grow, as we learn, and as we age. Automotive is a very interesting area to talk about, with especially as the industry is changing. Theoretically, it's going to become a service industry versus a product industry. What I mean by that is they're saying with autonomous vehicles and the ways that people are engaging in transportation is going to change. Theoretically, we're not going to go buy cars 20 years from now. I question that a little bit, especially in the American culture with muscle cars. How dare you take away my 8 gallons a mile gas goes or a muscle car, right? But just like anything, things will prevail, and there will be semblance of ownership going forward. But if you take companies like Bentley or Mercedes or anybody that's on the cusp of looking at autonomous automotive services, right? They're really talking about this from a service industry point of view. So Bentley in their concept car for autonomous vehicles, right? If you look at this, just this one image, you can kind of understand what's going on here, right? This is set up for a date night, potentially, right? But what they're also thinking about these vehicles in the service point of view of, this needs to be malleable, it needs to be dynamic. It's the same car that dropped me and my wife off for a date will then be used an hour later to go take 6 business people out to an important meeting. And you're not going to need the roses. You may not want that table there, depending on is it a working vehicle, or am I going to work in the vehicle, or am I just using it for transportation there? And so all sorts of possibilities open up for the automotive industry when they start to think more dynamically about humans. Certainly the human factors, the physical and cognitive aspects, but also the emotional aspects to it too. Because these environments help seed emotion and help set a precedent for how we might engage going forward. And furthermore, thinking about social dynamics, right? This is an image from an autonomous vehicle in Florida that was recently, they stopped the trials recently. And just like the whole autonomous vehicle world, right? It's not that it's not possible, right? The technology is there to do it. It actually becomes more a question of viability. What do we do with insurance companies? What do you do with the legality of situations? And these things are very rampant in the conversation space right now. And so oftentimes technology can lead the way to new possibilities, there's all these softer sides of the world that really have to be accounted for. So when I hear that, autonomous vehicles are going to be the only thing available in 2030, I'm like, wait a minute. There is so much more to that conversation than just can we do it? How's it being done? How's it being policed? How's it being policy? And where is responsibility? And all these other aspects lie within that conversation. At the end of the day, one of the best tools that I've found to help with understanding people, certainly businesses do their market segmentation and things like that kind of help point to where consumers might be for their business. But that doesn't really give you an understanding of who these people are. And that's where we start to develop personas, right? And personas come in all different flavors and profiles and ways of communicating them. But the real goal behind personas isn't necessarily to fully understand the market segmentation where the business should be heading, but it's really like, how do we understand these people? What motivates them? What engages them? And to be quite frank, there is no one perfect persona for any company. You usually have a batch of personas that paint a dichotomy between the different types of users and humans that a company might engage with. And it's tools like these that let us peer a little bit deeper into the soul of our consumers and stakeholders and figure out what's the best way to engage them, what's the best way to work with them, and what's the best way to provide products and services that will fulfill their needs, latent or explicit. And then finally, affairs. So by affairs, I mean context or situations, right? Experiences, we're having an experience right now, but experience, to be clear, just doesn't have to do with this moment, right? It's about the before, during, and after. That's the umbrella of experience. And then there's the interactions. If you look at a customer journey, the before, during, and after, there's all these touch points along the way where you're having interactions, explicit or implicit. And then finally, perceptions, what you were thinking this might be, coming into today's conversation versus what you're hearing right now, good, bad, or ugly, I don't know. And then what you're going to walk away with, right? You're going to form perceptions about us, about other companies, about this industry as a result. And they're complicated and they're complex. I'll unpack that a little bit more as we go along, but just to give a very quick analogy around it, by complicated, we'll use cars as an example. By complicated, I mean, it's like an engine. It's a systems design problem, right? An engine can be designed, it can be root caused when it breaks down, and it can be fixed. These things are engineered and designed to be that way. If we look at complex, this is more like traffic. You can't design traffic, you can't predict traffic for the most part. You can do urban planning and roadway systems that in an ideal way, this is how it should be. People are predictably irrational, right? So you can't say what's going to happen on a day-to-day basis with traffic because people are angry when they drive some mornings. They get in accidents that are their fault or not their fault. All these things happen that you cannot design for, and all you can do is disposition them after the fact and then help that lead into new possibilities going forward if there's enough there to make major decisions accordingly. So to talk about experience, right? I'll briefly touch on Disney, who is basically the masters of experience, right? They have their tentacles into every aspect of a lot of people's lives, from the moment when they're little kids through, when they're aging adults, because people love this brand, love the stories that they tell, and love the engagements and experiences that they provide. To take it further, right? Here's a journey map that someone had created a few years ago about the Disney experience. And it's just not being at Disneyland, your actual adventure over here. Your Disney experience starts all the way over here in this discovery and awareness phase, right? It starts when you're 2 years old and you see your first Disney film or cartoon. That's when you get hooked into it. And it's through all these engagements, explicit and implicit engagements, that Disney is actually really curating you as a consumer and as a user, that they're making you a part of their brand circle. So in this story, this narrative here is about someone taking a Disneyland experience, but it starts all the way over here with them talking to their friends. If we were going to take a New Year's trip to Disneyland or Disney World, right, I'm probably starting to think about that 6 months beforehand. And the only reason why I'm thinking about that 6 months beforehand is because, you know, there is a desire to be a part of that Disney world or part of that Disney experience because of the way they've engaged me throughout my life. And you just work yourself along on all these different touch points or interactions that you may have with Disney that will happen months before you actually arrive at the park. And Disney's very good about this in terms of when you sign up to go to the park, you can determine your echelon of engagement. They will reach out to you, they will prep to you, they will make it help you set your adventure up for success by preemptively anticipating your needs or letting you know that you should be thinking about this and that and the other. That way you can have the best possible experience because that's what they want, that's how they keep you engaged. And so you go through this whole experience flow over the course of until you actually go to the park, and then you're having an experience inside of the park itself. And again, think about if you've ever been to Disneyland or Disney World, right? It's not a bunch of users, it's a bunch of people from all walks of life. And the possibilities of experience are endless, and they understand this. And so what they're trying to do is provide the world's biggest sandbox so you can build your sandcastle of experience that allows you to get the most out of it. And then actually after you leave the park, you're not done. They're not done, right? Because theoretically, you should have a more heightened experience and affinity with the brand. You come all the way back, and you start planning your next trip before you ever leave again, or the next movie you're going to watch. The next time you go see a movie in the theater, theoretically, you're much more engaged and excited to go do that because you've seen some things that you hadn't seen before. And it's a self-reinforcing loop that magnifies every time you go through the cycle. And again, customer journey maps, user experience maps, they take on many different flavors. It depends on the context and the situation at hand. Again, if you go Google customer experience map, journey map, what have you, you'll just be littered with these types of things. And they're all right? It depends on the context of the situation for how your journey map will evolve for whatever situation's at hand. The simplest way to start is to just think before, during, and after, right? A lot of people just concentrate on the experience themselves, the engagement at the moment of contact, but the really good companies that are really the best in breed that create an experience that start way before you ever engage tactically at that moment. And at the end of the day, the reason to look at these things and the reasons to think about the world in this kind of way is because it's all about relationships, right? We are social creatures at heart. Whether that be very one-to-one, two-to-one, what have you, we're all creating relationships at all time. And then I'm not just talking about personal relationships, but brand experiences and relationships as well. So I said I'd unpack complicated versus complex a little bit more. Let me give you some very more explicit examples around that with a little more context. So complicated versus complex, I gave you a little bit of example, but the easiest way for me to break that down is users versus people. This is why I'm not the biggest proponent of user experience design as a term. It's about human experience design because there's different flavors of human, right? There's users and people. To explain that further, let's look in traditional commercial aerospace, right? There's pilots and crew. They're there to do a job. They're there to do specific tasks and certain behaviors for safety and enjoyment in some cases. Versus the passengers. You know, I got to spend a lot of my former life just buying a ticket and flying around the world to observe the users and the people inside of an airplane. And passengers, I can't believe some of the stuff you see happening on an airplane. I'm sure we've all witnessed different gnarly things happening that you're just like, what is going on here? But that's because they're people. They're full of emotion. They're full of behaviors that are unpredictable, right? But the pilots and the crew, right, they're there to do a job. They're there to do specific tasks for safety and for assurance of that point A to point B. So then when we talk about flying people in space in the future, right, a lot of the industry to date have really been geared up towards flying astronauts, right? These are well-trained, seasoned individuals that are there to do specific jobs, to do specific tasks, and to know what to do when things might go wrong, or if they have an anomaly to any situation. In the future, when we're talking about, anneal colonies and having this great, the size of the population of the United States living in an O'Neill colony, right? You're not going to be able to train 300 million people to act accordingly. It's like expecting everyone in Disneyland to follow the rules and do the right thing. Not going to happen, right? So when we talk about astrotourists, right, we have to acknowledge the fact that we are dealing with not only users, but people. And the two can commingle, and you can be part of both camps, right? Because there is, like on a plane, on a commercial airplane, you're trained as a user, safety briefings and things like that. But you're really there as a consumer. You're there to get from point A to point B and be a person on that plane. And the behaviors that you see in a plane really illustrate that point. So at the end of the day, the reason why I tease users versus people apart, in a very black and white sense, it's about you're designing for people to get a job done, or you're designing for people to have an experience. I often refer to it as the sandbox of experience, because if you give anybody a sandbox, they're going to build a sandcastle in their own way, and it's going to be different from yours, and yours, and from yours, just because what's in our mind's eye about the ideal sandcastle is going to change, and we're going to create different experiences as a result. There's a professor called Ted Hunt that's based out of London. Sometime in the fall, I came across this list that he made, and I loved it so much because he really illustrated these points in a very one-to-one sense of when we talk about users, what do we mean? When we talk about people, what do we mean? And at the end of the day, it goes back to the summary I had on the first slide. Users are for people to get jobs done, or for humans to get jobs done. People are really just predictably irrational beings that are trying to have an experience, and they bring so much more to the equation that it's hard to account for because that equation is so dynamic. Let me give this just a second. I'm not a big fan of full text slides, but I couldn't escape it on this one. I think the last two lines really illustrate it the best. Users can be easily pleased. People are complex and trouble, right? Because we carry all of our lives back into the place. All right, just to drive this home a little bit more in a fun way. I'm assuming we all know who Will Smith is, right? So I'm going to illustrate two different characters. This is one of the fun exercises I like to do in any job or situation that we're dealing with is, what if we took movie characters and put them in this situation? How would they act, right? So what happens if we flew Captain Stephen Pilner from Independence Day to space, right? He would act a certain way, he's trained a certain way. He would be able to get the job done amongst all the strife going on. What if we flew the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air to space? Right? Is he going to behave? I mean, no, he got kicked out of Philadelphia and to live with his uncle in Bel-Air, right? It's going to be hard to tell this person what to do, to get them to follow every single rule or regulation or policy, because it's not in his nature, right? And so when we think about, having all these people in space, living and working, doing all sorts of things, right? We can't just think about Captain Hiltner from Independence Day. We have to think about Fresh Prince of Bel-Air too, because he's part of the equation going forward in the greater long-tail sense of humanity. Just a couple more notes here. There is a lot to be drawn on from history when it comes to these future outlook conversations, right? I was fortunate to work at Teague before I joined Blue Origin, and one of the special things about that company and other companies like DesignWorks, BMW DesignWorks, and a whole host of others that have worked in the commercial aviation industry is that Teague has been involved with Boeing for 70 plus years, right? And so they've been the driving force behind Boeings and airlines, trying to think about the human experience of flying. When planes were first created, they were very orientated towards like military and political use, a way of getting to A and B a lot faster for jobs to be done. But then the industry kind of opened up and realized that this can be beneficial. Certainly there's a capitalization market involved, but This is good for everybody, right? Bill Gates is famous for saying the first internet was actually steamships going across the Atlantic, right? Because it shortened communication time frames. Same thing happened when commercial aviation came about. And so Teague is a design agency, right? And part of their job in working with Boeing all these decades is to look at the human experience of flying and to help airlines and Boeing understand how do you create the affordances to let people be people, but in a safe and reliable way. And taking that into the future, right? There's a concept from Airbus's plane for 2050, I believe, right? They're looking ahead. They're taking learnings from the past decades and trying to apply it forward. Not only in how people are acting today on airplanes, but what affordances will they want in the future. They're trying to rationally predict and guide the path towards what affordances the humans need so they can, and what technologies will be available so they can have a pleasurable nominal flight that is not only efficient from getting to A to B, but that is part of the pleasurable experience of being a human that is able to travel. So it's important to take those learnings from the past, and not only from commercial aviation, you can look at it in transportation, education, hospitality, healthcare. There's all these learnings that apply forward. And a lot of the work has been done, not in earnest of what it needs to be going forward, but you can abstract what has been learned over the decades and start to apply that forward, or at least not forget about it when we're designing technologies and capabilities into the future. So with that, I'll leave it with a few questions to spark a conversation, hopefully, but we can take it in whatever path we want. So, how do we design for the next generation of space travel as people for the decades that come? A couple things to keep in mind. The steep macro trends, the guiding forces of kind of culture and humanitarian aspects, that these five forces really shape and govern a lot of things that happen or could happen or might happen. There's a lot of ebb and flow and how it pulls different puppet strings of all the things that happen in our day-to-day lives. And what about more of the tactical, practical things like, what do we do about space traffic control, debris cleaning, things like that, which I think there's some conversations coming up in the future about that. What about urban planning for space? I didn't have a better word other than urban to make the relation. But space law and policy. What about politics? How does that change, right? Colonization, right? As a species, we saw that happen through the last several centuries. And how do we learn from that and do a better job of that going forward? And, and other things like religion and the idea of self. With that, I'll open it up.
So, I see we have our first question, I guess. So I can do an intro to that. Go ahead. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Alan Boyle from Deepwire. And I wanted to ask, that's an interesting distinction on astronauts versus astrotourists. And a couple of things come to mind. One is there's that whole debate over whether people who do fly into space should be considered astronauts and get their wings. And so I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. And also the fact that, for example, New Shepard is going to go up and you don't really have any crew on there. You just have the astrotourists. And so what do you expect the dynamic to be for that type of flight? How it might differ from traditional spaceflight?
So I'll be honest, I'm very limited in what I'm able and willing to talk about to the media, right? We're still fairly insular as a company. And these are our points of view and our worldview, so I can't necessarily speak on behalf of the company. But what I will say is things like about the carbon line, right? That's a thing right now, right? Generations out, it's might be no different than crossing a state boundary or flying to another country, right? So I think in a certain point of time, it's an important mark that we understand. I think going forward, in times way ahead of us, that it's going to become a smaller and smaller thing, potentially.
So it won't be, it will be more of a regular situation. You're just kind of going on a flight And just as people today, you don't get a set of wings for flying on an airplane, you just go and do your thing and have fun. That might be the same for going to space.
If you draw on the imagination of humanity and where you at least see sci-fi stories and films where they lead you, that is not part of the conversation space anymore. But again, those are kind of my own personal thoughts on how that situation will evolve over time.
Who's first? Hi, I'm Devin. I guess sort of abstracting that, when you're forecasting using personas, like, what is the ratio of, are you drawing on like historical context for creating a user space and then forecasting that forward, and like where does that line go from like that research to that sort of like instance of creation for you in your process, or both? Yeah.
Well, I think this is part of the power of the sociology aspect that comes into practice for some of the things that we do, no matter what kind of industry we're working in, is when you look at people, we've actually changed very little over the decades and over the centuries, right? What I mean by that is, like, if you can start to look back at people's motivations, if you can really start to uncover what's motivating people, right, and you can say, okay, well, that's what's creating their emotions, and their emotions are creating their behaviors. It's really the behaviors, the way that behavior is invoked is really what's changing over time, right? We went from, analog letters to email to text, and that's just part of the way that communication has evolved for us through the way that technology has allowed us to invoke it. But at the end of the day, if you trace it all the way back to the core of humans around motivations, right? We're social creatures. We want to communicate, right? So to me, that's where the sociology aspect is one of the more important aspects of what we do, because if we can look at those root motivators, right, then it really opens up the idea of, well, it's communication that's important. And why do we communicate? Looking at the emotional aspects of it. And teasing apart all the different emotional possibilities, right, might dictate what avenue, what behavior we go down, and what is valuable at the time, right? And if you think about it, texting and emailing, right, it has its place. It's very efficient, it's very optimized, especially in the business sense. But if you're trying to send a love letter, right, what's the best way to do that today? It's still tried and true as it has been for decades, if not centuries. Pen and paper, right, it's still authentic. I'd say even more so now than it had been in the past, because we've lost some of that analog way of being, for better and for worse in many different situations. But as we progress with technology, some of those initial ways of doing things actually have more value in the right context.
Okay, cool.
Okay. I guess we'll start.
All right, well, thanks. So one of the inescapable constraints that you have to face when you're designing for space is budget, because every kilogram of stuff that you need to get into space in orbit and beyond costs something to get there, beyond even just its material value. Would you say that going forward in kind of the astrotourism industry, or really just as people go into space industry, living in space, working in space, will user experience really be able to be a driving factor towards advancing technology, towards like finding cheaper ways to put things into space, or in situ resource utilization, or things like that? You talk about these O'Neill cylinders, but they're still centuries out. You have to get millions of tons of material together. A lot of it's still going to come from the Earth. There's a lot of drivers. Kind of what's the reciprocal model here? Is user experience going to be kind of enslaved to budget forever, or would you say that user experience can drive increases in budget and increases in technology that's that fundamental to what we're going to be able to do?
Both. And there's a reason why I say this, and I'm not trying to slide. I'm actually going to do the whiteboard as I do, to draw a Venn diagram that I actually left out of this presentation, or used the one instead, but it's, I can't remember the guy's name off the top of my head who did this, but it's called the innovation paradigm, or the innovation framework. It's from the guy who started Frog, and was a seminal professor at the Stanford D School and stuff like that. And it's called we called it X at Microsoft, People, and T. And so what we're talking about is business experience and technology, and in the center you get innovation, right? And that where the conversation goes from there, it used to be that companies decades ago would talk about operations, marketing, and engineering, which is still tried and true, but some of that lives at the intersections right here, right? A holistic company like Apple or Tesla or what have you, who's been very successful in whatever marketplace and disrupting marketplaces, tend to think more like this. And what they're actually asking themselves here in business is it's about the viability. Is it the cost? Is it return on investment? Sometimes it's okay to have a loss leader to push technology or experience forward. So business experience and technology is really about viability, desirability, and feasibility, and finding the balance of those three aspects. And really it's about the trade-offs, right? What is the goal that you're trying to go after, and what is the merit in which you're trying to do this will help you have that triad of conversations. I was talking earlier with someone where, at least in the design profession over the last couple decades, there's been a big push to get designers to go get MBAs as well. And there's plenty of graduate schools now where you can go get a design strategy or a graduate design degree, but you can also couple that with an MBA. Because it's one thing to say, here's what's desirable for people, you know, people. You're going to get a ton of pushback on business saying, well, yeah, but you know, that's going to cost $30 million. We can't afford that right now. Or it could be a pushback on technology of like, well, Microsoft, for example, yes, what's fun about that place is you can create anything almost at some point. But what's the constraints you're working under? Do we need to have this out in 3 months, 3 years, or 3 decades, right? And it's the balance of those three things that really help make those calls. And so a framework like that, or that kind of mentality, really doesn't give you the answers to your conversation, but it lets you have a holistic conversation on what's the trade-offs between like user experience versus business outcomes versus what's feasible to achieve within the certain time frames and bounds.
We have that gentleman over there.
First of all, can you describe at all the sorts of things that you actually design at Blueworth?
Short answer would be no. This is more of an NDA policy than anything else. But do you have a follow-up to that question?
I figured that one was probably going to be a no. So I just was just on a different topic. Like, it seems to me like even if you're a passenger, you have to follow some rules. Like you have to know the safety evacuation rules and so forth. Would you say that there's somewhat of a spectrum between like users and people?
Yes, absolutely. I did mention that earlier, right? As a person on an airplane, right? And you see all the things that people do, the way they socially interact, good, bad, or ugly, right? But at the end of the day, you're still responsible if an anomaly happens to get yourself off the plane, right? Or to put your mask on first and then your child, right? And it's these types of things that are there for a purpose and relatively understood. But then I'll also ask, right, how many times did you actually, in the last year, if you flew, paid attention to the safety anymore, right? People kind of take these things for granted because they implicitly know what to do if they've done these things routinely. Now, certainly early on, when you start flying, whether it be for personal or work, right, you may be much more attentive to those types of things. But the more and more you do something in life, the more it just becomes background to a lot of your endeavors.
So, just before the next question, I think there's an interesting sort of conversation happening between budget, the iterative process as it comes down to past experiences, and obviously there being a spectrum. Like if you think about today's airline passenger, right, they have to still go through watching a video and still be aware and essentially read the card. So still go through some instructional training, if you will, to board an airplane. If you're sitting by the exit door, for example, you must comply with specific regulations. Now, we got to that place over a span of 100 years, essentially. due to the budget restrictions, flying people to space is expensive. So therefore, it's really hard to test how humans behave in circumstances that are unorthodox. So, however, there are technologies today, some of which you are widely aware of through Oculus Quest and things of the likes, right? Where that technology can actually help us test better. And just like training pilots today actually takes them into a room with essentially a video game, that doesn't cost as much as actually taking a plane up in the air. We can utilize those technologies, and this is where this conversation becomes, I think, very powerful, because we require those technologies to actually make it easier for us to make the experience of people flying into space safer, better, etc. better. This is where a cross-functional team can actually make it so that millions of people are living and working in space, not just engineers building the rockets or system designers designing training programs that astronauts, astrotourists, even passengers still have to go. I felt like this was an important point to be made, that this whole thing, it's not just business, people and technology combined. It's a lot of other things that combine, as we design this uncharted experience. All right, that's sort of 2 cents. Do we have another question? Sure.
So I really appreciated your highlighting the Disney user journey. I think we all can relate to that very well. Where are we in the user journey for space tourism? I know where it was 10 years ago. So I'm interested in that, and particularly as designers, as your experiences have. And how are we getting users engaged at 2 years old? Or is that a natural consequence?
Great question. I don't think we can answer the first part of your question, unfortunately, because that's proprietary information. But Blue, for example, has an initiative called Club for the Future. I do believe we're allowed to talk about that. I'm sorry, it's kind of a media mind. But essentially, Club for the Future, and I'm sure the likes of that are, there's a lot of different initiatives currently sparking up, both on SpaceX's side, Virgin's side, as well as Blue's, where people from early on want to engage kids into thinking that this is something they can do. And again, coming back to my previous point, one of the reasons I'm in this industry is because I was a space nerd growing up. I'm originally from Russia. When I was 4 years old, my dad would be like, "Oh, you're going to Mars, you're going to Mars." I'm like, "Okay, I'm going to Mars." But I ended up here, and I'm fascinated by the fact that, as someone who does not design, I do not design rockets, I design software, I can still help people get to space. I can still help humanity, whatever. The question that you raised is very dear to my heart. I'm somewhat frustrated by the fact that we have Instagram influencers with millions of followers that are, my point here is that Instagram is such a powerful tool for someone to promote space tourism, space exploration, all of the likes, and not a lot is being done.
What I'll add to that is that it sells itself. What I mean by that is, right, as a species, right, we've always looked up at the stars and wondered what we are adventurers and discoverers, right? We charted across the flat world to discover that it's not flat, right? No one fell off the edge, right? We've always had this inherent risk that we're willing to take. And it's that, I think, that everlasting wonder of what's next, what's possible, what's out there, that when I say it sells itself, it's just ingrained into us that as a species to go discover, to go adventure. And so it sells itself in the idea that it's just part of our DNA to go wonder and to go do, right? We've explored most of this sphere that we live on right now, right? So obviously we're at the capabilities to start going beyond. And so I think it's just the inherent next step that we would do regardless of, no matter what companies at bay are working on these problems. It's just part of our drive as a species to go do that.
So it seems like you're trying to make it so that everybody feels like they have and like growing up, like young kids have a chance of like, yeah, I can finally go to space. So how are you going to make it so that anybody could actually do it, not just people who can't afford it, just like allowing anybody who's ever dreamed of it to actually fulfill that dream and make it approachable?
Without getting into like
Yeah.
IP details and stuff, it's really more about like, I'll draw back on commercial aerospace, right? If you look back the 1920s and the 1930s when companies like Boeing were really coming to be, things like that, it was extremely expensive to fly, right? It was the military use or political use or the uppest of echelon capability to go to pay, well, even today, a first class apartment on Qatar, right, is $30,000 a trip. Who in their right mind would pay that? Well, there are people who can because they want that kind of privacy. So I think it's just a matter of time more than anything, right? With any technology, right, it's always expensive out of the gate. The viability of it is super, it's possible, but it's super high. And so it's really about just the occurrence and like with any company, the decreasing cost of time is going to enable that. I'll leave it at that.
Kind of a follow-up question to that, but can you talk a little bit about the interactions between the designers and engineers from, like, going off your last picture with the transparent airplane? You know, it's like a designer sees that and goes, yeah, that's phenomenal, that's great. An engineer sees that and they're pulling their hair out going, you know, no way. How are those conflicts resolved?
Your work. No. That's a very valid question. It's conceptual work versus production work, essentially. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No. I mean, like, one of the facetious things I will often say as a designer is it's my job to keep my head in the clouds. And it's an engineer's job to put my feet back on the ground, right? And it's the tension between those two things where I think innovation can progress forward. So you need that play and that contrast to not only just be practical, but also imaginary at the same time. And certainly when we're dealing with money, we've got to be mindful of that. That's another part of the equation. And you know, I think you mentioned it earlier, right? Yes, I worked on design teams for most of my career, but it's always cross-functional working groups that I work in because it's that interplay between viability, desirability, and feasibility that actually make innovation happen. Yeah.
I would add to that, looking through the history of flight in human history, we've always been inspired by the likes of Icarus and other mythological characters. Not only back in the days, but even up until now, the inspiration aspect of, I don't want to say design because again, this is kind of muddying the water in terms of what the term actually means. But hopefully this is not proprietary information. Jules Verne, for example, holds a massive place inside of blue culture, and he was a writer. But it was what he wrote about and how he inspired generations to follow. And I'm not talking about our generation, I'm talking about any exploration, any type of explorer. Those types of people, they're the inspiration. Like obviously that render is never going to happen. Maybe it will, but not in the way that it is currently. Maybe we come up with a new material that can, you know, a lot of what ifs. It's the inspiration and the idea that that's moving forward in terms of what is possible. And coming back to Kyle's one of his early slides, it's figuring out what is the right thing to do before figuring out how to do that thing right. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's really cool.
I'll also add something based upon this diagram right here, which is like just in a very simple mental model, like if you had a linear process going through any design exercise or maker exercise, right? Up here, what is, you know, here between designers and the business people, for example, you might be figuring out what is going on today. what do we understand about the world in all its different slices, right? And then with experience in technology or design and technology, you're often doing the debate and the dance of what if, right? And that's where I'm saying head in the clouds, feet on the ground type of tension going on. And then ultimately, like when you settle on some of this idealness of where we could go that is practical and feasible to a degree, it's about what will, then what also makes sense to the business. So that what is, what if, what will kind of flow of things really helps capture that conversation and kind of box the narratives of what might happen.
So it's an interesting thought. You evoke science fiction a lot, Kyle. In a lot of science fiction works, there are species, kind of changes in humanity as people go into space fundamentally. And Isaac Asimov, the spacers, and Alistair Reynolds, the conjoiners, people changing themselves, like with genetic modification or cybernetic enhancements, to actually live in space more effectively. There could be a point in the future where hundreds of thousands or millions of lives are on the line, and one bad action can kill everyone on the next colony trip to Europa. How would you foresee some fundamental change in humanity, like adapting ourselves by making our bodies more resilient or incorporating cybernetic systems, nanotechnologies, far future stuff, but what if human design isn't so much for humans anymore?
Yeah. I might bring up sci-fi a little bit, but I'm actually not a sci-fi guru. I do think it holds a lot of inspiration and captures a lot of the heart of humanity and the things that we think possible. And really does a decent job sometimes of articulating the good, bad, and ugly of humanity in different contexts and different situations. I mean, how we evolve as a species in terms of manufacturing a little bit more of our own self. I mean, we've been doing that for generations at this point. And without being an engineer in biosciences or biomedical world or anything like that, I don't have a really good, honest answer for you, other than like, we'll continue to do what we do and adapt. And that is like one of the most visceral things that we do as a species, is constantly adapt to the context or the situations that we're in. And we wouldn't survive or thrive without just that innate ability. Did I dance around it well enough?
To take your question sort of down a notch, without thinking too far ahead in the future, think of the challenges, and this is actually, I guess, a question for everyone. Think of the challenges that might arise in space in the next 20 years. We know that the amount of space in our orbit is finite, so at some point we'll need to come up with a space traffic control system. But that won't be similar to air traffic control, where pilots are piloting vehicles and there's communication in English usually established. It's going to be essentially code dictating which satellites can fly where when a new satellite is being put into the orbit, right? So an interesting challenge, or mind puzzle, if you will, is when that software needs to get updated, who will be the one pushing that code? Will it be someone sitting in the Pentagon? Will it be someone sitting in the UN? Those are questions, and I see the gentleman there writing. These are essentially my opinions, and this has nothing to do with blue. It's just something that I like to think about. This is something that is happening in the next 15 years. A decision on space law and who will dictate how software gets updated that flies orbits, that flies satellites in the orbit. That's one of the questions someone in this room might be actually working on. Yes?
Kind of going off of that, can you maybe speak a little bit to the transition that's occurring right now between people actually driving cars and people actually flying airplanes, and the kind of interface that you need to do those tasks versus fully automated, where you don't necessarily need that and you're more overviewing this, like you're doing more of a systems overview sort of thing? Can you speak a little bit to the transition of that and like how you go about tackling such an issue?
I'm going to screw this up because I'm really bad at remembering things off the top of my head. I believe we're in out of Gen 5 of autonomous vehicles. I own a Tesla myself, for example. It's not an autonomous vehicle by any means. It was hailing today and it couldn't drive, right, obviously. So there are limitations like that, but regardless of that, there is a key moment to understand about autonomous vehicles in general when there's a driver in it currently. in the state that they are right now. We're not eliminating the problem of, oh, someone needs to drive this car. We're just moving that problem aside and turning that problem into someone needs to monitor the car that we hope is driving well. So I like where your head's at in terms of, it's a good sort of analogy to make between, where we currently are, both in airlines and commercial, individual cars going autonomous. In my opinion, we're far out, like Kyle was saying, not only because the autonomous technology is not there yet, it's also the legal aspect of it. And again, who will be tasked in pushing that code out is one of the questions that I always ask myself. So I hope, maybe we can chat after this. It's a great, beer conversation, but I don't have a clear answer to that question. We're out of time.
We are out of time, but thank you. This has been a great conversation. Thank you very much for coming and joining us here today.
Absolutely.
And to everybody here. Next month, and I don't have the date off the top of my head, it's an April date in Starfish.
March 3rd.
March 3rd will be the next one in
March
April.
2nd.
Whatever the Monday is, same time, same place.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll be back here. And then April, we're still working on, but then in May, there is actually, there's an International Space Policy Perspectives workshop symposium going on. So watch for all of those announcements as well, so different sides of the conversations. Thank you. Bye.